Imagine you're opening your own garage door on an ordinary Saturday morning, preparing to drive the car you legally purchased with your own money 3 months ago. Suddenly, 3 police cruisers pull up, sirens wailing, red and blue lights flashing across the entire street. A middle-aged woman is pointing directly at you, screaming that you're stealing the car she just bought yesterday. Sounds insane. Right. That's exactly what happened to me. And it was only the beginning of a story about power, ambition, and hidden truths. If you're watching this from somewhere and think your HOA might have issues too, leave a comment below. Maybe this story will help you find your way forward. Now, let me tell you the whole thing. My name is Garrett Holland. I'm 44 years old, a retired software engineer who spent 2 decades building security systems for tech companies across the West Coast before cashing out early. I bought a house in Riverside Commons, a quiet HOA community in suburban Colorado, about 8 months ago. The neighborhood had tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns, the kind of place where people waved when you drove past and minded their own business. I kept to myself mostly, enjoyed the peace, and thought I'd finally found a place to settle down without drama. That Saturday morning, May 4th, started like any other weekend. I woke around 8 a.m., brewed coffee, and decided to head to the downtown farmers market around 9:30. I grabbed my keys, walked through the door connecting my house to the garage, and pressed the button to roll up the door. Sunlight poured in as it lifted. That's when I heard the sirens. 3 police cars came screaming down the street, tires squealing as they pulled up to my driveway. Officers jumped out, hands near their belts, eyes locked on me. I froze, keys still dangling from my hand, completely confused. Then I heard her voice, shrill and piercing, cutting through the morning air like a knife. "That's him. He's stealing my car. I just bought that Tesla yesterday and he's trying to take it." I turned and saw Patricia, the president of our HOA, standing on the sidewalk. She was in her late 50s, wearing a pink cardigan over a cream blouse, designer glasses perched on her nose, and clutching a Hermes handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her face was flushed red. One manicured finger pointed directly at me, and in her other hand, she waved a crumpled piece of paper that she kept pressed against her chest, refusing to let anyone see it clearly. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair and a skeptical expression, walked toward me with his hand raised. "Sir, can you step away from the vehicle, please?" he said calmly. I nodded, still processing what was happening, and moved to the side of the driveway. Patricia was practically vibrating with rage, her voice growing louder. "He forged the documents, he hacked the system. Somehow I paid $89,000 for that car at the Denver Tesla dealership yesterday. And now he's pretending it's his." The officer looked at me, then at her, then back at me. "Sir, do you have registration and proof of ownership for this vehicle?" he asked. I nodded, my hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "Yes, officer. I bought this car 3 months ago, on February 15th. Everything's in my wallet and the glove compartment." I handed over my driver's license, then retrieved the registration, title, and insurance documents from the car. The officer examined them carefully, then radioed in the VN. Patricia was still yelling in the background, but when the officer asked to see her paperwork, she clutched it tighter and stammered something about it being temporary, that she'd left the real documents at home, her voice suddenly less certain. The radio crackled back within 2 minutes. "Vehicle registration confirmed. Registered owner Garrett Holland. Purchased February 15th, 2024. The officer's expression shifted from neutral to visibly annoyed. "Ma'am, this vehicle is legally registered to Mr. Holland. Do you have any documentation proving you purchased this specific car?" Patricia's face went pale, then red again. She stammered, glancing down at the paper in her hand as if it might suddenly transform into proof. I have the temporary paperwork. Maybe I got confused. Maybe my car is still at the dealership." The officer wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, did you call 911 to report a theft without confirming the vehicle was actually yours?" She didn't answer directly, just muttered something about being mistaken and turned to leave. But it was too late. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, phones out, recording everything. I could see at least a dozen people watching, whispering to each other, and within 2 hours, the video was all over the neighborhood app with 147 comments. Most of them weren't kind to me. People I'd never spoken to were calling me a thief, a con artist, someone who didn't belong in a respectable community like Riverside Commons. What struck me most wasn't just the accusation itself, it was Patricia's reaction when the officer confirmed the car was mine. She didn't apologize. She didn't look embarrassed or even flustered. She just stared at me with cold, calculating eyes, her jaw tight, then walked away without a word. As she turned, I noticed a man standing at the far end of the street, middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket, watching the entire scene. He wasn't with the neighbors, didn't have his phone out, just stood there observing with an intensity that felt out of place. When Patricia glanced in his direction, he immediately turned and walked away, moving quickly like someone who didn't want to be noticed. I had no idea who he was, but the deliberate way he left, right after making eye contact with Patricia, stuck with me. The officers apologized for the confusion, told me I was free to go, and left. I stood in my driveway for a long moment, staring at my red Tesla Model S, the car I'd saved years to buy, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. That afternoon, I received an email from the Riverside Commons HOA. The subject line read, "Notice of violation, unauthorized vehicle storage." I opened it, already feeling the tension building in my chest. The email stated I was being fined $500 for parking a vehicle that violated community guidelines. According to Patricia, my red Tesla didn't comply with the approved neutral vehicle color policy outlined in the HOA covenant. I immediately pulled up the covenant document I'd signed when I bought the house. I read through every single page, every section, every clause. There was no mention of vehicle color restrictions anywhere. Not a single word about what colors were or weren't allowed. I read it twice more just to be sure. Nothing. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion or miscommunication. Patricia Wyndham had just tried to publicly humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood, failed when the police confirmed I was telling the truth, and was now retaliating through official HOA channels with a completely fabricated violation. I opened my laptop, created a new folder on my desktop, and titled it Riverside Commons Investigation. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to uncover something far bigger than a petty HOA president with a power complex. I was about to discover a system built on lies, theft, and intimidation that had been running unchecked for years, and I was going to tear it down, piece by piece, using nothing but the truth and the law. I spent that entire Saturday afternoon diving into every document related to Riverside Commons HOA that I could access through the community portal. What I found wasn't just concerning, it was systematic. Patricia Wyndham hadn't been elected as HOA president in 2020. She'd appointed herself after the previous president moved out of state, and according to the bylaws, that appointment should have triggered a special election within 90 days. That election never happened. She'd been running the HOA unopposed for 4 years, making decisions without oversight, and nobody seemed to question it. The first thing that jumped out at me was the violation pattern. I built a spreadsheet tracking every notice issued over the past 2 years. In 2022, the HOA averaged 6 violations per month across 124 homes, mostly routine things like trash cans left out or minor landscaping issues. But starting in January 2023, the numbers exploded. By mid-2024, Patricia was issuing 8 violations per week, 47 notices in just the first 6 months of this year alone. When I cross-referenced each violation against the original HOA covenant, the legally binding document every homeowner signed at purchase, 90% of recent violations cited rules that simply didn't exist. There were no approved paint colors, no vehicle specifications, no landscaping height requirements, and no noise restrictions in any official capacity. Patricia was inventing policies, enforcing them as law, and collecting fines for violations that had no legal standing. Colorado Statute Section 38-33.3-209.5 explicitly prohibits this. Any rule not outlined in the recorded covenant cannot be enforced through fines or liens. She was breaking state law with every single notice. The financial impact hit me next. I added up the fines collected in just the past 6 months. $127,000 was taken from homeowners in our community. But the publicly available financial summary from the last board meeting showed no breakdown of where that money went. Just a vague line labeled Special Assessment Fund, with zero detail. I posted an anonymous survey on the neighborhood app asking if anyone had received questionable violation notices in the past year. Within 3 hours, 23 families responded. The house at 412 had been charged $800 because their grass was allegedly half an inch too tall the day after a professional mowing service left. The couple at 567 faced $1,200 for repainting their door a color they'd already received, written board approval for 6 months earlier. A single mother at 789 was hit with $2,000 over supposed nighttime noise complaints that didn't exist in any HOA records. No neighbors had ever filed anything. Each story revealed the same tactic: target someone, fabricate a violation, collect the fine, and move on before anyone could organize a response. Then an anonymous message arrived in my inbox. If you really want to know what's going on, look up Wyndham Property Services, check who owns it. I pulled up the Colorado Secretary of State Business Registry and searched the name. Wyndham Property Services, registered in 2021, 1 year after Patricia took control of the HOA. Owner and CEO Patricia Wyndham. Director of Operations Harold Wyndham, her husband. My jaw tightened as I clicked through their public tax filings. The company reported revenue of $340,000 in 2023. Their primary client, listed plainly in the documents, was Riverside Commons HOA. I ran the math. 124 homes paying monthly dues of $180 generated $267,840 per year in HOA income. But Patricia's company was billing $340,000, an excess of over $72,000. When I added the $127,000 in fines collected this year, the gap closed perfectly. She wasn't just overcharging, she was funneling fine money directly into her own business under the cover of vendor payments. The contract between the HOA and Wyndham Property Services was posted under vendor agreements on the portal. 37 pages of deliberately vague language about maintenance, landscaping, and emergency repairs. Buried on page 24 was a line I almost missed. Monthly consulting fees $8,500. $102,000 per year for consulting services that were never defined, never itemized, never justified. I started comparing their invoices against market rates. Landscaping was billed at $450 per house when the going rate was $120. Painting jobs marked at $8,000 when contractors quoted $2,500. An emergency repair invoice dated March 15th, 2024. Charged $12,000 for work that I distinctly remembered never happening. I'd been home that entire week, and no crew ever showed up. Patricia Wyndham wasn't just abusing her authority. She was running an organized theft operation using the HOA as a front, and her husband was helping her do it. That evening, around 7 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, calm and deliberate, spoke immediately. "You're the guy with the Tesla this morning." "Right." I paused. "Who is this?" He didn't answer directly. "I used to keep the books for Riverside Commons. Got fired in 2023 after I started asking the wrong questions. You're digging into Patricia, I can tell. If you want the full picture, meet me tomorrow at the public library, 10 a.m., navy blue jacket, Wall Street Journal in hand. Come alone." I started to respond, but he cut me off. "They pulled the same stunt on me. Public accusation, total humiliation. Ran me out before I could fight back. I still have the financial records, the real ones. Bring a USB drive." He paused, then added one last thing. "You probably saw someone watching this morning when the cops showed up. That was me. I needed to see if you'd fold or fight. You fought. So now I'll help you." Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, replaying his words. The man in the dark jacket, the one who'd locked eyes with Patricia before walking away. He'd been the HOA accountant, fired for finding what I was finding now, and he'd been watching this morning to see if I was worth the risk, if what he said was true, if he still had the original financial records from before Patricia cleaned house. Then I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was about to crack it wide open. I glanced at the time. 8:30 p.m. 14 hours until the meeting. I opened my laptop and started a new document titled Evidence Log, whatever this man had to show me. I was going to be ready to use it. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., unable to sleep past dawn. My mind still racing through everything I'd uncovered the day before. I made coffee, reviewed my notes one more time, and grabbed an empty USB drive from my desk drawer. By 9:15, I was parked outside the public library, watching the entrance from my car. At exactly 10 a.m., a man in his early 50s walked up the steps wearing a navy blue jacket and carrying a folded copy of the Wall Street Journal under his arm. I recognized him immediately, the same man who'd been standing at the end of my street yesterday morning, watching Patricia accuse me in front of the police. I got out of my car, walked across the parking lot, and approached him carefully. He looked up, made brief eye contact, and nodded toward the library entrance without saying a word. We went inside, found a quiet study room in the back corner, and closed the door behind us. He sat down across from me and extended his hand. Kenneth Abbott. I was the accountant for Riverside Commons HOA from 2019 to 2023. I shook his hand and introduced myself. Garrett Holland, you said you were fired for asking questions. Kenneth nodded, his expression serious. Patricia hired me right after she took over as president. For the first 2 years, everything seemed normal. Standard bookkeeping, paying vendors, tracking dues. But in 2022, I started noticing discrepancies that didn't add up. I raised concerns during a board meeting in February 2023. 2 weeks later, she called an emergency session, accused me of mismanaging funds, and had me removed without severance or explanation. He paused, glancing toward the door as if checking to make sure we were still alone. The board didn't question it. Half of them are people she appointed herself after the original members resigned or moved away. The others don't show up to meetings anymore. She runs everything solo. That explained how she'd operated unchecked for so long. No oversight, no accountability. Just Patricia making decisions and signing checks without anyone looking over her shoulder. Kenneth pulled a small USB drive from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between us. Before they locked me out of the system, I copied everything. Bank statements from 2020 to 2023. Every invoice Wyndham Property Services submitted. Email threads between Patricia and Harold that I archived from the shared HOA server before they deleted them. Scanned checks that had already cleared. It's all here. I stared at the drive, my pulse quickening. What exactly did you find? Kenneth leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Patricia created a second account in January 2022 called the Special Assessment Fund. Officially, it's for emergency repairs and community improvements. In reality, it's her personal slush fund. She's the sole signer. Every fine she collects, every violation fee, every penalty goes into this account first. Then she transfers it to Wyndham Property Services disguised as consulting fees or emergency expenses. He opened his laptop, plugged in the USB drive, and pulled up a spreadsheet that looked like it had been meticulously maintained for years. Kenneth pointed at a column labeled Special Assessment Fund. The transactions were staggering. $8,500 transferred every single month like clockwork, labeled as monthly consulting services with no further explanation. Over 2.5 years. That alone totaled over $250,000. But the transfers didn't stop there. I saw payments labeled Emergency Landscaping, Urgent Roof Repairs, and Community Safety Upgrades, none of which I'd ever witnessed happening in the neighborhood. Look at the deposits, Kenneth said, scrolling down. In 2022, the fund took in $187,000. In 2023, $234,000. In the first 6 months of 2024 alone, $143,000. Add it all up, and Patricia has funneled $564,000 through this account in 2.5 years. I felt my jaw clench. And where does it go after Wyndham Property Services? Kenneth pulled up a third file. Personal bank statements that he'd clearly saved before losing access. Straight into Harold Wyndham's personal checking account and Patricia's brokerage account. They're writing themselves owner distribution checks every month. It's textbook embezzlement. Kenneth pulled up an email thread dated March 12, 2024. The subject line read, Q4 distribution. Patricia had written to Harold, transfer $78,000 to account ending 4892. Mark it as a consulting bonus. Delete this email after reading. A second email from April 3rd was even more damning. We need to increase monthly intake. Target 25,000 per month in violations. Focus on new residents. They don't know the covenant well enough to fight back. I stared at the screen, the words sinking in. Patricia wasn't collecting fines opportunistically. She was setting monthly financial goals like a sales quota and strategically targeting people who wouldn't know how to defend themselves. Just then, the door to the study room opened slightly. A library staff member poked her head in, smiled politely, and said, "Just checking if you gentlemen need anything." Kenneth's face went pale for a split second. He shook his head quickly. "No, we're fine. Thank you." She nodded and closed the door. Kenneth exhaled slowly. "I'm probably being paranoid, but Patricia has eyes everywhere. Let's keep this quick." He unplugged the USB and handed it to me. "There's one more thing you need to know. That Tesla incident yesterday wasn't random. Patricia has done this before, but it's not just about humiliation. It's a business model." He pulled out a printed document, a property sales record from January 2024. A family named Brennan lived at house 434. Patricia went after them hard, accused them of housing a dangerous dog, filed false complaints, and issued $15,000 in fines over 3 months. They couldn't afford to fight it, so they sold their house in a panic and moved out of state. Harold Wyndham, through a shell company called Riverside Investment LLC, bought their house for $45,000 under market value. 2 months later, he flipped it for a $60,000 profit. Kenneth leaned back, his expression grim. "He's done this to 4 families in the past 2 years. Harass them until they break. Buy their property cheap through the LLC. Hold it just long enough to avoid suspicion. Then sell high." "You were supposed to be number 5. I sat there, gripping the USB drive so tightly my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was a coordinated scheme to destroy families, manipulate the real estate market, and profit from people's fear and exhaustion. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. Kenneth's jaw tightened. "Because they destroyed my reputation. Because I have a family to feed, and Patricia made sure no HOA in the state would hire me again after she spread lies about my competence. And because someone needs to stop them before they ruin more lives." He stood up, zipping his jacket. "You've got everything you need on that drive. Bank records, emails, invoices, property transactions, the whole picture. What you do with it is up to you. But if you're smart, you'll take it to someone who can actually hold them accountable." I stood as well, gripping the USB drive tightly. "I'm not going to the police yet. I'm going to build a case so airtight that when I expose them, there's no way out." Kenneth gave me a small, grim smile. "Good. Make them pay for every lie they've told. And when you do, let me know. I want to be there to see it." I spent the rest of Sunday going through every file Kenneth had given me. 847 pages of bank statements, invoices, emails, property records, and scanned documents. By Monday morning, I knew I needed to do 2 things. First, find the other families Patricia had targeted and get their testimony on record. Second, consult with a lawyer who could tell me exactly what laws had been broken and how to build an airtight case. At 9 a.m., I called Franklin and Associates, a law firm in Denver specializing in HOA litigation and financial fraud. I scheduled a consultation for Wednesday afternoon. Then I started tracking down the families. Kenneth had given me 4 names: the Brennans in Arizona, the Torres family in Nevada, the Okonkwo's in Texas, and a widow named Walsh who'd moved 1 town over. Kenneth had kept their contact information from his time as an accountant, which made reaching them possible. And when I explained what had happened to me with the Tesla, each one responded almost immediately. They'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. I started with Mrs. Walsh. I called Tuesday morning, introduced myself, and explained briefly what Patricia had done to me. There was a long pause, then a quiet but steady voice said, "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to ask me that question. Yes, I'll talk. Come by tomorrow at 2 p.m., Wednesday afternoon." I sat in her living room, a modest apartment filled with photos of her late husband. She was 82 years old, sharp as ever, and visibly angry as she recounted her story. "I lived in Riverside Commons for 11 years. My husband passed in 2021. I was managing fine until Patricia decided I wasn't. Violation notices every week. Grass too long, bushes uneven, weeds I couldn't see. $50, then $200, then $500. 3 months later, I owed $12,000. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a folder she'd kept. Every notice Patricia had ever sent. I cross-referenced each one against the covenant. Not a single violation was legitimate. Riverside Investment offered me $215,000 for my house. My realtor said it was worth $260,000, but I was exhausted. I sold. 2 months later, they flipped it for $295,000, $80,000 profit off my fear. Thursday evening, I spoke with the Brennan family and the Torres family over video calls. The Brennans had been accused of housing a dangerous animal. Their 12-year-old golden retriever somehow classified as a threat, despite never having a single complaint on record. They didn't just get fined. Patricia escalated to animal control, filed police reports, and created a paper trail that made them look like negligent pet owners. $15,000 in fines later. They sold at a $45,000 loss. The Torres family faced a different angle. Patricia claimed their teenage son was throwing late-night parties based on anonymous noise complaints that were never filed with the HOA or police. $22,000 in fines. Constant harassment. And they finally sold just to escape. In both cases, Riverside Investment LLC swooped in with below-market offers, held the properties for 8 to 10 weeks, then resold at massive profits. The Brennan's house netted Harold $60,000. The Torres property brought in $55,000. By the time I finished the calls, the pattern was undeniable, and the victims were ready to go on record. They wanted justice, and they were willing to testify. Friday afternoon, I walked into Franklin and Associates and met Ms. Jacobs. She was in her late 40s, no nonsense, and got straight to the point. I handed her the USB drive and gave her a full walkthrough. From the Tesla accusation to Kenneth's financial records to the victim testimony I just gathered. She plugged the drive into her laptop, made a secure forensic copy to preserve the chain of custody, and reviewed the files methodically. When I finished talking, she leaned back and said, "Mr. Holland, this isn't just HOA misconduct. You've documented embezzlement, wire fraud, and RICO violations, federal crimes. Patricia and Harold are looking at 15 to 20 years in prison if prosecuted fully, plus full restitution." She opened a new document on her screen. "Here's what we do. We file formal complaints with the Colorado Attorney General and the FBI. You've got cross-state victims, which gives federal jurisdiction, and the documentation is strong enough that they'll move fast. But if you go public now, you risk them destroying evidence or fleeing. We let the authorities freeze their accounts first. Then you can expose them." I sat there weighing my options. Part of me wanted to confront Patricia immediately, watch her face when the truth came out in front of everyone. But Ms. Jacobs was right. If I tipped them off, they'd run, and justice would slip through my fingers. I nodded. "Okay, we do it the right way, but when it goes public, I want to be there." Ms. Jacobs gave a faint smile. "I'll make sure you are." She drafted the complaint that afternoon, citing specific wire transfers, fraudulent invoices, and coordinated real estate fraud across state lines. Within 48 hours, both the Colorado Attorney General's office and the FBI Denver field office confirmed they were opening investigations. The cross-state element and the strength of Kenneth's documentation meant they prioritized the case immediately. Federal authorities don't move that quickly unless the evidence is overwhelming and the crimes are serious. The trap was set. Patricia and Harold had no idea what was coming. All I had to do now was wait for the hammer to fall. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of waiting while federal investigators worked in the background, securing subpoenas, freezing bank accounts, and building their case. Ms. Jacobs kept me updated, and by May 14th, she confirmed that arrest warrants had been issued and agents were ready to move. She'd coordinated with them to time the arrests for maximum impact, right when Patricia would be at her most vulnerable, in front of the entire community. On May 15th, I received an email from the Riverside Commons HOA. Subject line, Special Meeting, May 15th, 7:00 p.m., Community Center. Patricia was proposing a special assessment of $500 per household to fund emergency infrastructure repairs, another $62,000. She had no idea federal agents were waiting. She had no idea tonight would be her last performance. I arrived at the community center at 6:45 p.m. The parking lot was packed, 98 cars representing most of the 124 households. I grabbed my laptop and a portable projector from the trunk and walked inside. Patricia and Harold sat at the front table, calm and confident, dressed like they owned the place. Kenneth was 3 rows back. Mrs. Walsh sat near the middle. The Brennan, Torres, and Okonkwo families were ready on a video call link I'd set up, their faces waiting on my laptop screen. Ms. Jacobs stood near the exit, phone in hand. Everything was in place. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. Thank you all for coming. We need to address an urgent issue. Our irrigation system requires immediate replacement for $62,000. The board is proposing a special assessment of $500 per household, payable within 30 days. A man in the second row raised his hand. Can we see the inspection report? Patricia smiled tightly. The assessment was conducted by Wyndham Property Services. The full report will be available after the vote. I stood up. I have a question. Patricia's smile faltered when she saw me. Mr. Holland, this is not the time for personal grievances. I walked down the center aisle, laptop in hand, and stopped 10 feet from her table. This isn't personal. It's financial. You're asking people to approve $62,000 based on a report from a company you own. I think they deserve the full picture. The room went quiet. Patricia's face flushed. That is a baseless accusation. I opened my laptop, connected the projector, and turned it on. Ms. Jacobs had already cleared the evidence for public display since the accounts were frozen and subpoenas issued, so there were no legal barriers. The first image appeared on the wall. The Colorado Secretary of State Registry showing Wyndham Property Services owned by Patricia and Harold Wyndham. This is public record. Your company has been billing this HOA for years, and the numbers don't add up. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people leaned forward, others pulled out phones. I clicked to the next slide, the Special Assessment Fund bank statement showing monthly transfers of $8,500. This account is in your name, not the HOA's. $564,000 moved through it in 2.5 years. Patricia stood abruptly, her voice sharp. You have no authority to present private documents. I stayed calm. They're not private anymore. Federal subpoenas made them evidence. I clicked again. An email appeared. Subject line Q4 distribution. Patricia's own words to Harold, transfer $78,000 to account ending 4892. Mark it as a consulting bonus. Delete this email after reading. Another click. We need to increase monthly intake. Target $25,000 per month in violations. Focus on new residents. They don't know the covenant. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and a few people standing up to get a better look. Patricia's hands were shaking now. She gripped the edge of the table. This is taken out of context. You're twisting everything. Harold leaned over, whispering urgently, but she shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. I've given years to this community. You people have no idea what it takes to run an HOA. I opened the video call window. The faces of Mrs. Walsh, the Brennan family, the Torres family, and the Okonkwos filled the screen. Mrs. Walsh spoke first, her voice steady. Patricia fined me $12,000 for violations that didn't exist and forced me to sell my home at a loss so her husband could flip it for profit. The Brennans followed. We were accused of housing a dangerous dog when our golden retriever had never caused a problem. $15,000 in fines, forced out, and Riverside Investment bought our house cheap and resold it high, the Torres family added. Anonymous noise complaints that were never filed. $22,000 in fines. We lost our home. The Okonkwos spoke last, their voices firm. Same pattern. False accusations, inflated fines, forced sale, profit for the Wyndhams. The room was no longer just shocked. It was angry. People were standing, some shouting questions, others recording everything. Patricia's face went from flushed to pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing coherent came out. Just fragments of denial. You can't prove. This is a conspiracy. Then the door at the back opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in, FBI badges visible. One spoke clearly. Patricia Wyndham and Harold Wyndham. We have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and RICO violations. You need to come with us now. Patricia froze. For a moment, she looked like she might run, her eyes darting toward the side exit. Then her legs buckled and she sank back into her chair. Harold stood slowly, hands half raised, his face blank. The agents moved forward, placed them both in handcuffs, and read their rights in front of 98 people who had been lied to for years. As Patricia was led toward the door, she looked back at me, her expression a mix of fury and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend how it had all fallen apart. I said nothing. I just stood there, calm, watching justice unfold in real time. The door closed behind them. The room stayed silent for a beat, then exploded into conversation. Some people crying, others hugging. A few just sitting in stunned silence. Kenneth walked up to me, his voice low. "It's over." I nodded. "Yeah, it's over." Ms. Jacobs approached, a faint smile on her face. That was textbook. Clean, public, undeniable. I looked around at the faces of people who'd been manipulated and stolen from. They deserved to see it. They deserved to know. And now they did. The truth was out. The thieves were in custody. And for the first time in years, Riverside Commons could start to heal. The night of May 15th became a turning point for Riverside Commons. But the real work began in the weeks that followed. Patricia and Harold Wyndham were held without bail, deemed flight risks by the federal court given the scale of the fraud and the liquid assets they'd tried to move offshore in the days before their arrest. On June 15th, exactly 1 month after their public takedown, Patricia accepted a plea deal to avoid trial. She pled guilty to 18 of 29 charges, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Harold followed 3 days later, pleading guilty to 11 counts of real estate fraud and money laundering. On August 12th, both were sentenced in federal court. Patricia received 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Harold got 8 years in state prison, plus a lifetime ban from any real estate activity in Colorado. The court ordered full restitution, $564,000 to the HOA for embezzlement, $237,000 to the 4 victim families for real estate fraud, and an additional $125,000 in civil penalties between seized assets, frozen accounts, and the forced sale of their home. The government recovered over $1.1 million, more than enough to cover every dollar they'd stolen. On June 1st, Riverside Commons held new elections. Kenneth Abbott was elected president by an overwhelming majority. He asked me to serve as treasurer, but I declined. I told him I just wanted to live quietly and enjoy my home, though I agreed to help audit the financial systems and set up transparency measures. The new board passed sweeping reforms, quarterly public financial reports, an independent audit every year, a ban on board members doing business with the HOA, and mandatory annual elections. The 17 surveillance cameras Patricia had installed were reduced to 6, covering only shared entry points, and the footage was no longer accessible to board members without a formal request. The community began to heal. The 4 victim families received their restitution within 90 days. The Brennan family used the money to buy back their old house from the current owner, who sold it to them at a fair price after hearing their story. Mrs. Walsh, at 82, used her share to move into a senior living community with better amenities and peace of mind. The Torres and Okonkwo families put the money toward new homes, finally able to move forward without the weight of what had been taken from them. In late July, I received an unexpected letter from the IRS. It included a check for $84,000, a 15% whistleblower reward for providing evidence that led to the recovery of a major tax evasion case. Turns out the man in the dark jacket I'd seen watching on that first morning wasn't just Kenneth. Federal agents had been quietly investigating Patricia for months, but they didn't have enough evidence to proceed until I handed over Kenneth's files. I stood in my driveway on the first Saturday of September, 4 months after everything started, and looked at my red Tesla Model S. It was still parked in the garage where it had always belonged. I'd recently installed a new license plate, custom ordered, that simply read Justice in bold letters. Kenneth stopped by that afternoon with coffee, and we sat in my garage talking about how far things had come. He asked what I planned to do with the IRS money. I told him I was setting up a legal defense fund to help other victims of HOA abuse, people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back on their own. "What are you going to call it?" he asked. I smiled. "The Red Tesla Legal Defense Fund." Kenneth laughed, the kind of deep, genuine laugh that comes from relief and closure. We clinked our coffee cups together, and I drove the Tesla out of the garage for the first time in weeks. No sirens, no accusations, just me and the open road. As I merged onto the highway, I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the theft, the intimidation, and ultimately, the truth. Justice doesn't always come easy, and it doesn't always come fast, but when it does, it's worth every single fight. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt powerless against someone abusing their authority, just remember that the truth is stronger than any lie, and the law is on the side of the people who fight for what's right. This is Karma Clause, where we bring stories of justice to light. If you believe in accountability, in standing up for what's right, and in making sure no one gets away with abusing their power, then subscribe and support this channel, because the next story could be yours, and when it is, you'll want to know you're not alone. Drive safely, stay strong, and never let anyone steal what's yours.